Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We're going to go ahead and get started. I know folks are still out there grabbing their food. We have a really packed agenda for today. So I want to just go ahead and get some introductory matters out of the way. I'm Heather Way. I'm on the faculty here at University of Texas School of Law, and I'm on the steering committee of the Opportunity Forum. I'll be serving as the moderator for our discussion today. And thank you all for coming. We have folks from throughout Texas, as well as folks from different parts of the country. We even have a class of students who've come all the way here from Iowa State. And yeah, they're en route with some A&M students who are also here en route to Rockport to do some disaster recovery work. And we also have several in the audience, several disaster recovery experts. I want to recognize the folks that are here from FEMA and representatives from HUD and numerous different state and local agencies. We're really honored to have you here also, and welcome everyone to the UT campus on this beautiful Friday afternoon. I want to just start out by thanking our co-sponsors of today's event. We have the Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis, the William Wayne Justice Center for Public Interest Law, which is here at the law school, the Longhorn Center for Community Engagement, the School of Nursing's Center for Transdisciplinary Collaborative Research in Self-Management Science, the Graduate Program in Community and Regional Planning, the School of Law, and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Thanks to all of our sponsors for this event today and making the lunch possible. For those of you who are new to the Opportunity Forum, have not been to one of our events before, I just want to give you a little bit of background about what the forum is and what we're about. We are an interdisciplinary collaborative of faculty from across the UT campus, working to foster relationships and strategies to promote more vibrant and equitable communities in Texas. And we are now in our 7th year of putting on programs like this. The materials from our prior events are all up on our website, and the event today will be video recorded, so if you had colleagues and friends who cannot make it and want to listen in on the discussion, we'll have that video up in hopefully within the next 2 weeks. And you can find, it's UT Opportunity Forum, you can find our website with any search engine. And I also want to give you a preview of our upcoming events that the UT Opportunity Forum is involved in this year on the UT campus. Coming up really soon on October 20th, we are co-sponsoring a panel discussion on free speech on college campuses, a very timely issue. That's being presented by the UT's Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis and the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement. And in the spring, we are presenting a series of discussions on the impact of the Trump administration on access to opportunity in local communities and how jurisdictions are responding to that. We're going to include at least 2 events, one on immigration and healthcare, and possibly a third event as well. We're still organizing those, and we'll be posting updates on our website. And if you're here at this event, if you're registered, you should be automatically on our email list, so you'll receive notice as well about those upcoming events. A couple of things just about this event. If you like to tweet, there's folks that are out there tweeting about this event. You can use the hashtag OpFoForward to follow those conversations. And also, towards the end of the panel discussion, we will be, we'll have time for audience questions. And so there's note cards that have been passed around the tables. And just take time, if you have a question, fill that out. We'll be gathering those about halfway through the panel discussion. Unfortunately, we can't get through all the questions. We have such a compressed time to cover so many issues, but we'll do our best to work through as many questions as possible. And I think that's it. The way we're going to structure this is Dr. Shannon Van Zandt, I'm going to introduce her first. She's going to start us out by giving us a short slideshow presentation about Hurricane Harvey and social resilience issues arising out of the storm. And it has some great maps to show us. And then I'm going to introduce you to the rest of the panelists who will come up here, and then we'll follow our discussion. So let me go ahead and start by introducing Dr. Shannon Van Zandt, who joins us from College Station, where she is a professor at Texas A&M, and she's the interim head of A&M's Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning Department. Shannon is a leading national expert on community resilience and social vulnerability to disasters. We're real excited to have her here today. She is a fellow of the Harvard, the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center, and is the co-author of the book, Planning for Community Resilience, a handbook for reducing vulnerability to disasters. She is an active researcher and writer on community resilience issues, and the author of more than 45 peer-reviewed articles and papers and reports on disaster mitigation and social vulnerability. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Van Zandt to lead her presentation, and then we'll launched into our panel. Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Good. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to come. I think the last time I was here was maybe a couple of years after Hurricane Ike, which is where I got my start in disaster recovery kinds of issues. My background prior to that was in home ownership, particularly for low income and minority communities, and that has fit very well into my work looking at how vulnerable communities are affected by disasters. Heather asked me to kind of set the stage for what we were going to talk about today in terms of the Harvey event, which is very fresh on many of our minds. Some of us probably are still digging out, quite literally, in terms of dealing with the damage and the destruction that both the wind event and the rain event brought us to. And I think it's important to recognize the scope of this disaster as well as the differences in the kinds of impacts that different communities are experiencing. We have, I think, foremost in the media and foremost perhaps on our mind is the rain event that happened in Houston, one of our country's largest cities. But there are many, many other communities that have been affected in many ways much more severely in terms of the direct impact of the hurricane into these communities, many of which are very low capacity communities and have high levels of poverty as well as a high level of generally socially vulnerable populations that are going to have a lot of difficulty recovering. So to get started, just to remind us what the hurricane looked like, it was a very large hurricane. It's looking at these pictures as reminiscent of Hurricane Ike for me in terms of the area that it was headed into and a little bit about the uncertainty of the path. It's always something that we are concerned about that makes it very difficult for communities to know directly how to prepare because of where it's going to hit and the nature of the impact. This is a really nice map, and I should say all of these maps and photos that I'm going to show are from the media. It's really still early in terms of getting good data, and so a lot of this that you'll see is early estimates, and it may turn out to not be completely accurate. I think particularly for the meteorological data, it's pretty good. They're good at estimating those sorts of things. And you can get a very clear idea that the impact on Houston, the rain event, was unprecedented in real terms in the sense that we've never had rainfall of that extent in such a short period of time. I live in College Station, as Heather mentioned, and just in my neighborhood, which is on the south side of the city, we received 30 inches of rain at my house. Thankfully, our drainage system was able to handle it. You know, it's a lower density place, so the water has a way of draining off better, but it was a severe event for those of us who kind of experienced it. And of course, Houston experienced upwards of 50 inches, which, you know, they've had to adjust the scales to account for. This map shows the water levels. It's difficult to see, and obviously the numbers are not readable, but it gives you an idea of the variation in the depth of the water. And of course, that responds primarily to the local, the very local, the hyper-local rainfall, as well as the topography of the area and the watershed that it falls in. Houston has a number of watersheds running through it, which can make predicting where the water will go a little more difficult because the hyper-local rainfall can cause flooding on particular watersheds that it may not have as big an impact on other watersheds. And most people don't know what watershed they live in either, and so that makes it very difficult to kind of predict what the local effects will be. But you can see a lot of variation from relatively minor to very high levels of local rainfall and flooding. This is one of the more interesting maps, and again, it's a little difficult to see, but each individual dot is an early estimate of damage. And so what I think is most striking about the map is that you can see how it follows the watersheds. So those lines, the kind of linear thing and branches that you see are creeks and watershed and the channelized drainage that Houston has adopted as a way of dealing with its water. The darker colors represent higher levels of damage, while the lighter colors represent lower levels of damage. You also can notice several focus areas of damage from the Port Arthur area through, of course, Houston, which we're familiar with, Wharton area, which is where the Brazos River is coming down through that area, I believe, as well as the Rockport, Port Aransas Pass, Ingleside, Port Lavaca area, Port Aransas area, where I'm headed later today to take a look at things. So this gives you a sense of the nature of the event. This is another way to look at the structures with damage. This is using census block groups to show the levels of damage. So this is a little bit easier for you guys to see from the dot density map to a map that shows these concentrated areas, again, that are falling along the creeks and rivers that run through the area and are affecting the homes in immediate proximity to those areas. This dark area out on the west side is the Addicks and Barker Reservoir area, where there was a lot of unexpected damage. And I think that, that will be an interesting legal issue to watch over time, and how those homeowners deal with that kind of unexpected after the fact flooding that they experienced. What we're going to focus on today is this idea of social vulnerability. And this is the idea that people vary in their capacity to respond to disasters. To give you the definition, the classic definition comes from Blakey et al., as academics like to say, as though they're real words, from 1994, where it's the variation in terms of individuals, households, neighborhoods, in terms of their ability or capacity to really experience every phase of disaster, their ability to anticipate it, to cope with the immediate impact and whether they can evacuate or not, the immediate response, their ability to resist it, which would be things like being able to prepare their homes or units adequately for the type of impact that is expected. And that would have to do with both their financial resources as well as their physical capacity and capabilities to be able to do some of those things. And then, of course, to recover from the impacts of a natural hazard. Most of my work has focused on mitigation and recovery, which are kind of the phases long before and long after a disaster. Issues with preparedness and response typically are addressed by emergency management, and that interaction between emergency management and local officials, local planners, local organizations, nonprofits, faith-based communities, that relationship is a very interesting one to follow and observe during a time like this, because it varies dramatically from case to case, and sometimes that handoff and knowing who's responsible for what, even those directly involved with it may not fully understand. The way that I like to explain why I show a lot of maps, we'll say, and looking at vulnerability is, I think a lot of the sociological research that's focused on disaster tends to look at individuals and households without respect to their spatial location. And as a planner, it's very important for me to understand how those same characteristics that are affecting their damage are affecting their kind of everyday life choices. So some of you may have heard of the term geography of opportunity, the idea that people don't have the ability to live any place that they want, and that those restricted choices can have a big impact on their ability to take advantage of spatially based opportunities like jobs, education, healthcare, those sorts of things. So the geography of vulnerability is kind of the opposite of that. So this is the idea that social vulnerability exists. We know that there's variation in their ability to cope with disasters. But we also know that people in households are not randomly distributed in space, that people are concentrated in very particular ways due to a lot of their socio-demographic characteristics. They're concentrated, and a lot of these are pretty predictable. Things like concentrated poverty, like urban sprawl, like segregation, are having major impacts on where people are able to live in terms of their housing choices, the availability of affordable housing, and how that drives people to particular areas. And that those patterns will increase their exposure to flooding and other hazards, and they have both short-term and particularly long-term consequences for those folks. So one of the things that we often talk about is how disasters exacerbate inequality. Where we know people have these inequalities kind of in their day-to-day life, and then the impact of a disaster comes, and then there's this trajectory of recovery. And we hope that that trajectory is generally positive, But in some cases, the slope of the trajectory, if you will, is going to be very different for low income versus higher income households. So to give you an idea of some of these vulnerability characteristics, this map is showing the percent minority by language on the bottom, the storm path on top, just to kind of basic. So, non-English speaking, non-native English speaking folks, the darker the color, the heavier the concentration. Over here we have vulnerability by socioeconomic status, so that's basically income. And then on the top we have vulnerability by household composition or disability. So we know that there are a number of characteristics that are going to cause vulnerability: age, gender, income, education level, household composition, access to transportation, civic, their language ability, those sorts of things. And some of them are going to be more spatially concentrated than others. Race and ethnicity and income have a particularly large impact on spatial location, and so those tend to be the characteristics that show up again and again in the empirical evidence about differences in outcomes for those populations. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to just raise is the idea, particularly in Houston, of environmental justice issues. Environmental justice is very closely related to social vulnerability, although there's some different theories that come in here and there. But Houston, as we know, is an economy based on the oil industry, and so there are many toxic facilities in and around Houston. We also, and not just Houston, all down the coastal bend as well, although they don't tend to affect as large a number of people. But this gives you an idea of the hot spots of toxic risk in the area. And I want you to kind of keep this pattern in mind, because you're going to see it over and over again in terms of where the damage is located and that sort of thing. This map shows population density, so this gives you an idea of where people are living related to the height of the water. This is the share of population over 65, another very important element of social vulnerability. We know our elderly population has mobility issues, as well as the need to have access to health care and medication and help, generally help. And I know this, my in-laws experienced Katrina firsthand, and as my husband often says, that was the beginning of the end for them. Their health problems became more and more severe, and eventually my father-in-law died. My mother-in-law is wheelchair-bound in a nursing home. This is the share of the population that doesn't speak English well. Another thing to remember about Houston is the very diverse population that it has, one of the most diverse cities in the country, with particularly large populations of Hispanics, as well as Asians and African Americans. Liz is telling me that I have 0 minutes left. So, share of population and poverty, and then this is the one that I really wanted to kind of end with. The data is real early in the sense that I'm not confident about the damage assessments that we have yet. I don't think we have good counts on the number of people that are temporarily displaced that will turn into longer-term dislocation where they may never be able to come back. And so one of and I'm a statistics geek, I will say. So the number that I'm really interested in looking at is the relationship between the correlation between race, ethnicity, and number of structures damaged. Because I have a hypothesis that it's going to be a strong positive correlation. And I'm really anxious to get the data that helps me assess whether that's really true. Now, the scale of this event may have a way of diluting, no pun intended, those effects, but I do think you can take a look at this map. And for those of us who are familiar with looking at these maps, we talk about the arrow of white richness that comes in from West Houston into the Galleria area. And yeah, there's some damage there, but the concentration of damage appears, at least initially, to heavily favor the bluer parts of the map, which characterize the Black and Hispanic populations in the city. So that is something to pay attention to over time, how that unfolds. This is the same map with income levels. Again, I think you can see that there is, it's hard to tell for sure, but it looks like there may be a relationship between damage and income. There are some darker blue areas which are higher incomes on this map, and that would be kind of the Southwest Houston, Meyerland area that we know flooded very, very heavily. And just to kind of bring us back to pictures of the wind damage. Houston is water damage, it's flooding, but there's a lot of wind damage. And I was in Rockport on Monday, and I saw it firsthand, and it's very, very severe. It's worse than what we saw in Galveston. It is, I believe Rockport reports that they have 36% of their residential housing stock is either already gone or will need to be demolished. That's a very significant number for this sort of thing. So I'm over time, I'm going to stop there, but that gives us a place to begin our conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Shannon. Y'all want to come on up? The panelists will come and be seated, and I'll go ahead and start with introductions of all of you as you're making your way up here. I'm very excited to have the panel we have today. It's really a stellar lineup of folks, and really appreciate all of them are from outside of Austin for making your way here to be with us today. Let's go ahead and start. Andronika. Okay, I'm going to start with Andronika Morris, who's sitting to the right of Shannon, and then work my way down the row here. Andronika joins us from New Orleans, and she's there, spent her entire career there working to create affordable housing opportunities, and has years of experience working with disaster recovery programs. Andronika currently serves as the executive director for Housing NOLA. Housing NOLA was formed in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina as a public-private partnership to solve New Orleans' affordable housing crisis. And prior to that, Andronika implemented a series of disaster recovery programs to help Katrina survivors secure new housing. She was also the lead organizer for the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance, and she currently serves as that organization's chair. Thank you for joining us from New Orleans.
Thank you.
And to her right is Chriselle Palais, who joins us from Houston, where she serves as the co-director of Texas Low-Income Housing Information Services Houston office. Chriselle's work focuses on advocating to ensure that affordable, safe, and decent housing is accessible to low-income Texans, and her work includes close collaborations with local community organizing groups. Chriselle also has lots of experience working on disaster recovery issues. After Hurricane Ike struck Houston in 2008, for example, she worked closely with community leaders to identify housing solutions for historically underserved communities there, and also organized a fair housing summit for the Houston-Galveston area, among many other things. And prior to joining Texas Low, Chriselle was an architect specializing in high-rise multifamily design and development. And then to her right is Rebecca Elliott. Rebecca joins us also from Houston, where she is a reporter with the Houston Chronicle and covering City Hall with an emphasis on affordable housing. And since Harvey struck Texas, Rebecca has been assigned by the Chronicle to focus on how families are recovering after Hurricane Harvey and what the government is doing to help them. And since Rebecca started working for the Chronicle in 2014, she's been providing what is, in my opinion, hands down some of the best reporting in the country on city government responses to issues impacting low-income persons, including an incredible series of stories this past year on financial discrepancies in the city of Houston. Rebecca and her colleagues' questioning led the city to discover $46 million in unspent fund in the city coffers for affordable housing. And then to her right is Tom McCasland, who also joins us from Houston, and excited to have Tom here. Tom serves as the director of the City of Houston's Housing and Community Development Department. Prior to working for the city, Tom served as the CEO of the Harris County Housing Authority, where he led efforts to not only turn around the troubled housing agency, but also was working on recovery efforts after Ike hit while he was at the agency. And for the law students in the group, Tom is also a lawyer. He received his JD from Yale and spent several years in private practice at Vincent & Elkins before entering the public sector. He also served as the director of research for the gubernatorial campaign of former Houston Mayor Bill White. And Tom is also a major advocate in Houston for parks and cycling infrastructure, and has worked closely with the Houston Parks Board there to secure funding for the expansion of parks and trails in Houston. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and just start off. We talked about starting off this discussion, getting now more into the ground for those who are working on the ground on disaster recovery issues. If you could just start out telling us, what are you seeing on the ground now as far as the biggest challenges facing the most vulnerable survivors from Harvey? And maybe start with Chriselle.
So one of the things that we definitely are seeing, number one, hands down, is trauma. People have been traumatized. Disaster has a tendency to do that. However, in this type of traumatic experience, sometimes people suffer through trauma and then they'll kind of know what to do next. But if you are a person that is part of that vulnerable population, you don't know what next is. And I'm sure many of you probably have seen plenty of the news coverage where you got a millisecond snapshot of people in distress and trauma, but they're all trying to figure out what's next. So it's trying to figure out, so what processes are currently in place? Do they even exist? How do I apply? Will I even qualify? And then if I don't qualify, then what? And so the first stop, of course, was the GRB, and Tom did a magnificent job hosting and being the facilitator and the host for, all the thousands of people who were stranded, didn't have anywhere to go. And again, that was just the starting point. And so we're dealing with that. And then another thing that we're seeing over and over again is the immigrant population and the real fears that they face against, with staring SB4 in their face. And of course, we've been assured by government that it's okay, we won't deport you. But tell that to someone who doesn't have legal status here in this country. And there are several social service organizations that stand ready to help these families, but again, they don't feel comfortable. And so that's another issue that we're currently seeing over and over again. And this is just in the Houston area. So when we start moving forward and looking at other areas like Rockport or like Cleveland, Port Arthur and Beaumont, another issue that we're seeing is that these more rural areas or smaller populated areas simply don't have the social infrastructure in place to navigate any processes. Specifically in Beaumont and in Port Arthur, the shelter is currently a tent, a huge tent like a tent city. And if you don't have a wristband, I learned this speaking with Lone Star Legal Aid the other day, if you don't have a wristband to enter into the tent city, then you can't gain access. So that means if there are any social services that you could benefit from, you can't even get to those. So these are just some of the real stark realities that we're dealing with. And again, we work primarily with those vulnerable populations. So we're trying to assess the situation, but again, we're firsthand dealing with trauma and just the serious unknown at this point.
Thanks, Rochelle. Rebecca, if you could go next. Also, I heard something about you that you moved into an apartment complex that was in an area that floods, and can you speak to that? Or that you've been sort of really doing some on-the-ground reporting with residents. We're in an area where you've actually been living.
So this was, I guess, Thursday before Harvey hit over the weekend, and I woke up and thought, where do I want to be for this storm? And figured that Greens Point would be a good place to go. Greens Point is in the north of Houston, near the airport, and flooded very badly last year during what we call the tax day flood. And I figured, if we're going to see a really extensive flood event, Greens Point probably will be hit. So I did not move into one of the apartment complexes. My editors did not think that my actually getting flooded would be a great idea, but I moved into a hotel around the corner and essentially flooded myself into that neighborhood during the storm, and so was able to walk around both before the apartments started to flood and after the rain hit. And I think that one thing that really distinguished Greens Point this time around was that they knew the flood was coming, whereas in 2016 they didn't. And so I think it's kind of a unique case in that Harvey was not unexpected. People moved their cars. A lot of people evacuated ahead of time. Obviously, the damage was extensive again, and the currents ripping off of the bayou were very intense. But I think the mood there was a little bit different. One thing that struck me is a couple days after the peak of the flooding there, I walked to the Red Cross shelter, which was the first Red Cross shelter that opened in the city. And I showed up and there were more than 2,000 people there, and there were 200 cots and 400 blankets because the Red Cross hadn't staged enough equipment there and couldn't get stuff in once the water started rising, since it was such a flood-prone neighborhood. And so I think that, even though Houston anticipated this. The resources at the beginning were not there, and they continue to not be there to the extent that people need them.
Thanks. Tom?
Well, a lot of the topics have already been hit on. I've got a long list of challenges on the ground I could read through, but before we go there, I thought maybe to frame this a little bit more would be helpful. The biggest challenge, of course, is just the scale. This is at a scale that Houston has never seen before. We mentioned the George R. Brown, and it's a good reference point because while the George R. Brown is no longer active, the impact of the fact that we had nearly 11,000 people there in the space of 48 hours, 48 hours from when the decision was made to even open the shelter, gives you the sense of the horror that ripped through the city as a result. And it's accurate that we were not prepared for that. And when I say we as a local governmental entity, we as a state governmental entity, we as a federal governmental entity, and all the nonprofits that support us were not prepared for this. And so the second night that we were open, we had 9,000 people, 4,000 of them on the floor in the George R. Brown. And that gives you a sense of the unpreparedness. Those first few days, we were literally scrambling to get insulin, to get the most basic things that we needed into the facility. And then once the waters receded, we were able to get it in. But that scale that we saw in those first few days has not disappeared. And the same scale is out there, the damage is out there. And then from a different perspective, the resources that are coming are at a similar scale. And we as governmental entities at all three levels, and then the nonprofits who work with us are not prepared for that scale. And so the need for that capacity. The most vulnerable population has already been mentioned. By about day 4 or 5, once we stabilize the shelter, we immediately began focusing our attention on the folks who would be there when we closed. Whether that was 3 weeks in or 3 months in, these people would no longer have any place to go. As it turned out, it's about 1,000 people at the George R. Brown, with about 700 people ending up that were moved from the NRG. These are the folks, about a third of them who were homeless before the storm. A third of that, so about 10%, were chronically homeless, long-term homeless. And then the remaining portions were people who were at risk of becoming newly homeless as a result of the storm. People who had been housed but had no place to go. And that last point, I think, is the real question that is outstanding. While this was, and some of the maps showed, somewhat of a democratic storm, the ability to respond to the storm is certainly not democratic. The people who are living in those most vulnerable neighborhoods don't have the resources to respond. And one of the things that we've not wrestled with are what is happening to those moderate income, middle income folks whose had all their money in their homes, had all their money in their cars, and they lost everything. They weren't in the 100-year flood plan. They didn't have insurance. And now they're back to living paycheck to paycheck. And one instance of a job loss or anything else throws them back into poverty. And that's the scale of, all of these intersect, but those are the questions that we're wrestling with. Lots of nitty-gritty details if people want to get into those.
Yeah, I'm going to talk next about sort of what it is going to take. Texas doesn't have the most stellar of track records when it comes to disaster recovery. I mean, Rebecca, you did a series of stories last year about how there's still blue tarps on roofs in Houston. That's been a symbol for families that were impacted by Hurricane Ike, whose roofs were destroyed by the storm, and they still haven't been repaired 8 years later, now 9 years. And I just was looking up today, someone sent me a link that there are close to about $500 million in funds from Hurricane Ike that still haven't been spent by the state of Texas. So here we are, Harvey. And y'all have all worked on disaster recovery or covered it. What are your thoughts on what we need to do better this time to serve our most vulnerable communities? And anyone, jump in. And Andrew, feel free to talk about lessons from New Orleans, too.
Well, I thought Rebecca was going to go.
Am I going to go? Well, I haven't actually been in Texas for another major disaster. I've been here for the last 2 floods. But, I think that you mentioned this Blue Tarp program. It's been a major initiative of Tom's and Mayor Sylvester Turner's. essentially last year, the city prioritized this rapid repair program for roofs that still had blue tarps on them from Hurricane Ike now 9 years ago. And so I think that shows just how long it takes for these resources to come through and how long a lot of families are waiting. This time around, I think what has defined almost every family who I've met is improvisation. There is no assistance right now, and so they're figuring out what to do on their own. I'm following a family around right now. It's two elderly parents in their 70s and their adult son, and the father and the son are sleeping in a tent in the front yard. The mother, who suffered a massive stroke, is in a nursing facility. You know, all the way on the other side of town, there's a dad who's sleeping in a bus in the backyard while his family's at a hotel. And so while there is hotel assistance and there are limited funds from FEMA and kind of early checks that are being cut by the National Flood Insurance Program, there is far less available than people need.
I want to jump in on the blue tarp because I agree with almost everything Rebecca said, except that the repairs of the blue tarps was not a matter of funding getting to us. The city had $250 million from Hurricane Ike. It was a matter of priorities, and it was a matter of someone saying, this is what we're going to do, and have the political leadership to make it happen at the top level, and then the execution of it at this next level. And you've got to have both. But my first day on the job, the mayor said, and this was just over a year ago, asked me about the blue tarps. So I knew what his priorities were. And then we put together a program that grew our home repair program by tenfold, 1,000% increase in a single year. You know, we went from 70 to 700. But that's not going to be enough for what we're facing. And so it's that kind of execution that needs to happen, the political leadership at the top, and then the detailed work at the bottom in order for us to tackle this. And there are these funding resources. I don't want to say that it's not an issue. We need the funding faster. We still don't have funding from the 2016 floods for the CDB GDR. But the 700 roofs that we replaced, these are $7,000 roofs. These were not expensive roofs. It cost us $8 million. We had $250 million. So that some of this, in terms of getting repairs out there quickly, is that execution and political leadership.
And underneath and Chriselle, I want y'all to go next, but can you also, Tom threw out an acronym. We all love acronyms. Can you all explain CDBG-DR and give a little bit just of a overview of the sort of disaster recovery programs for those who are new to this topic? And Chriselle, do you want to start? Do you want to do that?
Sure. So I can give, I guess, a quick primer on CDBG-DR. That's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery. So those are HUD dollars that are specifically earmarked for recovery and disaster. CDBG is a form of HUD dollars that comes down on an ongoing basis that Congress basically designates how much each jurisdiction will get. But in times of disaster, when a disaster is declared, then jurisdictions are able to have access to an additional allocation, which is DR. Are you okay on that one?
Yes.
Okay.
And the only thing I would add is they are intended to fill the gap after FEMA insurance, private insurance, and nonprofits have addressed the needs. It's the remaining need that this CDBG-DR is intended to fill.
Okay.
Do you want to jump in to answer?
Yes, really quickly. So I'm sure that we can make a laundry list and spend a few days as to
Yes.
all the things that,
Yeah.
the wish list of things that could be done. But one of the things that Texas Housers has done is to identify and develop 7 principles to ensure that we have an equitable recovery. And if we, move forward within those 7 principles, government, nonprofits, everyone involved as far as trying to have proper recovery, that it needs to be equitable. So I want to kind of share some of those principles. And the first one is that we have to make sure that help from the government is accessible and understandable and timely. As I shared earlier, we are in a state of trauma right now. People don't even know that some of these resources exist in the first place. So we have to make sure that people know about these resources and they can navigate through these resources and they can be successful so that they can regain some sense of normalcy. We also have to make sure that we have safe temporary housing where communities are able to reconnect with their family and just their community at large. I mentioned earlier the tent cities in Port Arthur, Beaumont area. You know, right now, there's nothing in place to make sure that these folks are able to reconnect and again have some sense of normalcy. So as we move forward, we need to consider that. We also have to make sure that people have access to resources outside of housing. Yes, housing is definitely a main priority. However, there were several cars that were lost, jobs that were lost. And this is actually an opportunity for those who were underemployed to actually, you know, get employed so that they can actually benefit their family and make more money for their families, especially with all the disaster recovery jobs that are now available. We have to ensure that our government programs are transparent, accountable, and abide by civil rights laws. That is paramount. Also, homeowners need to be able to repair and rebuild in quality neighborhoods that suit their families. And that goes for homeowners and renters. And one of the things that during the hurricanes Ike and Dolly that the state of Texas did allow is the Homeownership Opportunity Program, where families were able to decide if their home was damaged to a certain extent, if they wanted to relocate to another community. And we need to ensure that that right still exists. We also want to make sure that neighborhoods are free from environmental hazards and there's an equitable allocation of infrastructure investments in communities that have not had access to proper infrastructure in the past. And I'm sure we'll, you know, probably get into that a little later, but that is part of the crux of many of the issues that we continue to see over and over again. So the common thread of all of this is that people just have not been treated equitably. And we need to make sure that that's a #1 priority if we want to rebuild and rebuild fairly.
Thanks, Rochelle. Andronika.
So we've been talking about a lot of things up here so far, and all of them are heartbreakingly familiar, unfortunately, to what happened in New Orleans and the rest of Southeast Louisiana when Hurricane Katrina rolled through. We just marked the 12th anniversary last month. Oh, actually, it's in October. I mean, I'm in August. And so what we would always, part of the reason I'm here is as a cautionary tale for the rest of the country as we now kind of we're in this new place, this new normal where these storms are now typical. You know, it would be great if we could just focus on Harvey, but unfortunately we can't. We've got to focus on Harvey, Irma, and the devastation that Hurricane Maria has wrought throughout the Caribbean. And everything that everyone says is dead on. But what I would offer in addition to all of that is that we also have to be realistic and patient. And the reason I urge that is that because if you're impatient and you're unrealistic, your leaders will bamboozle you. In the name of rushing things, in the name of meeting the pressing needs, these communities will end up with programs that will not serve them. They will not, if you rush them. These federal programs are incredibly complicated. One of the things that many of us decried post-Katrina was the fact that the federal government at that point chose to use CDBGR as the funding source. That is now typical 12 years later, but when Hurricane Katrina hit, we weren't sure how the money was going to be allocated. And those of us who worked in affordable housing all shook our head at funding being pushed through one of the most heavily regulated pots that the federal government has control over. And the hamstrings that this puts on your recovery efforts. So that's why you cannot be impatient. Need is critical, and that's why Tom's point of coordinating with FEMA is incredibly important. These communities have to be stabilized with the appropriate resources. And right now, those are going to be FEMA funds and philanthropic dollars and some good old ingenuity is what's going to have to stabilize these communities for now, because if you rush the deployment of the CDBG funds, I promise you, You will regret it. We rolled out billions of dollars in the Road Home program. They helped hundreds of thousands of people who get home, but the people it did not help, they deserved to a almost criminal degree. Just as a highlight for those of you who do not know, the Road Home program was rolled out in response to the great outcry for so many people who were underinsured with flood insurance in New Orleans or didn't have flood insurance at all because they lived in parts of the city that didn't historically flood until they didn't need it, and some people couldn't afford it. So this billion-dollar program was created, and because of the regulations it was designed, instead of looking at the need, it was designed using the assessed value pre-storm as a start-off point. So if your house was worth $80,000 and it's going to cost $150,000 to rebuild, don't worry about the $150,000. You cannot get it. Despite the fact that the state government had been allocated $150,000 for you. You were not eligible for that full amount. You were going to be capped at the pre-storm value of your home. You would be further penalized by the fact that you did not have insurance. A program designed for the underinsured and uninsured included in it a penalty for the people who met those qualifications. This is what happens when you rush program, and rushing is relative, right? This was still a program that took almost 3 years to write the first check. So, again, but it's standing up and announcing, it's standing up and saying we will be doing this. And again, how the gap measures, our city government stepped in and actually allocated a few $1 million to a couple local banks to provide bridge loans to people as they waited for their checks. They, again, in the name of rushing and getting the program out quickly, they ramped up and started qualifying people without the funds in hand. So our local city government used some leftover home funds and placed it on deposit with a couple of banks so that they could at least do bridge loans. We had 2 local banks. One did about 300 loans. One did about a dozen because the second bank used traditional underwriting criteria despite the fact that they had the cash on hand in their bank. And these folks had guaranteed commitments. They underwrote them using credit score, traditional underwriting criteria. Again, in the name of rushing to say that we had something, that we were doing something. So I would urge patience and practicality and transparency, certainly, but also you guys and the communities that you serve, you guys have got to get really clear on what these programs can and cannot do. We've also learned, I was fortunate enough to go up to DC last week or a week and a half ago with some members of representatives from Texas, and we learned that your congressional delegation has asked for some things already. They have asked for resets in the priorities for CDBG funding so that it goes down from 70%, going to low to moderate income folks down to 50%, very similar to what happened with Katrina. They've also asked that the public comment period be shortened from 30 days to 7 in the name of expediency. I would urge you all to write letters and say that the difference between 30 and 70 days, it's like the reverse butterfly effect. When you're talking about this much money, it is negligible. You will not, I can almost guarantee that you will not see that money a day, an hour earlier. Between waiting 7 days, taking 30 days over 7. I can almost guarantee it. So taking the 30 days, particularly given how traumatized community is, given the issues, giving people the chance to understand what's happening so that they can make plans and that these communities can stand themselves up is vital.
Thanks. Shannon, did you have anything to add on this topic of recovery and?
Well, I mean, there's so many things that are bothering me about kind of what we're seeing, and I think getting back to the idea that I think your original question was about what's it going to take for us to kind of learn from our mistakes, and very frankly, I'm not sure that we will. I mean, there's always a window of opportunity after a disaster when people are willing to make some changes because they're so overwhelmed or angry or upset about what happened that they want to make sure it never happens again, as well they should. But that window, you never know how open it is or how quickly it's going to shut, and it always does shut. Whether you have 30 days or 3 years for that willingness to stay is, may vary from person to person and certainly from event to event. But it's important to try to take advantage of that opportunity while people are still willing. But she's absolutely correct in saying that rushing things, disasters have a way of compressing things in time and space in terms of a lot of the things that we will see happen and we are seeing happen after this are things that a lot of them would have happened anyway, but over a longer period of time. But what the compression does is to rush these decisions and to force people to make choices that they don't have the right information to make. And I think that's one of the reasons that we consistently try to say, you have to have a good fact basis. You have to be tracking some of this information. You have to make it available to local officials, particularly low capacity communities that don't have their own information databases. Houston is very fortunate. It is a very high capacity place. It has a lot of resources, a lot of very high level expertise, but even they don't have all of the information we need to make decisions quickly. And for these smaller communities that are struggling, they don't have anything. They have no basis on which to make these decisions. And when you force these decisions to happen more quickly, the result is that you're going to exacerbate existing problems, and you're going to make things actually worse rather than better. And it's very unfortunate. I know I feel frustrated. I know a lot of the people in the audience feel frustrated. And as an academic, I've been writing and talking about this for almost a decade now. And I've said it in rooms where there were people that should have listened and had an opportunity to make some different choices about how communities plan and how they prepare for disasters. And even when you're sitting there and you're speaking to them and they're nodding their head and they know that what you're saying is correct and they know that the next big one is just a season away, there's still the political will just doesn't seem to be there. And I'm a little, in some ways I fully expect to see the same things that have happened in past disasters to happen again. But my little glimmer of hope is that the scope of this disaster is such that it has affected people who have power and who have resources. And when they get mad, things tend to happen much more effectively than they do than people without a voice.
And I'd assuming that there is political will this go round. What do we need to be doing differently as we rebuild to not only help people rebuild their lives, but protect lives in the next flood that we know is going to come? It may be next year, it may be 5 years down the road, but what do we need to be doing differently to protect communities? This is a question for all of you, but Shannon, if you want to start us out.
Because I'm still talking.
Yeah.
You can tell me to shut up anytime because my students who are out there know that I will just keep talking. But I think we all recognize that the scale of disaster is extraordinary. And I am hearing from the media, a variety of media, and also my own little connections, that there is a willingness and that there is an interest in building back better, which has become a cliche that we say over and over again and we actually haven't accomplished anywhere yet. But the desire is there. And so I'm seeing and I'm getting a lot of calls, and I know the other people on the panel and a lot of us in the room are getting calls from groups that have the potential to really make a difference, that have resources, that have the ear of the state government, that have the ear of somewhat of an ear with the federal government, and certainly a lot of our local governments. And I think what we need to see is kind of a groundswell of demand and frustration and anger that holds our elected officials accountable for actually making some changes. When I hear them talk about the rainy day fund, I'm like, if this wasn't a rainy day, I'm not sure what we're waiting for. So, there is money there, and I think there is some interest and willingness to spend some of it, but we've got to make some changes, and they're not going to be easy changes, especially for Houston, because Houston needs to invest a lot of money, and it needs to do things much differently than it has been doing them in order to keep this from happening again. But the frequency, having 3 storms in a period of 2 years that flooded great proportions of the city, that's the kind of thing that may be necessary to keep it fresh in our minds, because disasters have a way of happening so intermittently that we forget. And I know, 10 years is a long time, and I have forgotten a lot of things, but I have not forgotten Hurricane Ike, and that's because I study it day in and day out. But for a lot of people, they don't remember. My students I don't even want to know how old they were at that point. But they don't remember. They don't remember Katrina, which is at least not firsthand. They've heard of it in the way that they've heard of 9/11, but they don't have an actual memory of it. And for those of us who are of a certain age, our memories are starting to fade a little bit. So it's important to keep it in the forefront and to just keep hammering away at it until we see some actual change.
I think there's this issue around resiliency, though, I want us to discuss, not only around flooding, but also the exposure to the environmental hazards that have been covered a lot in the press and many that haven't. And under Nika and Chriselle, do you want to speak to sort of what it's going to take to rebuild, but a way to rebuild resilient communities in all manner?
So it's funny. Resiliency has become kind of one of those catchphrases that the average New Orleanian despises hearing. We still use it, much to their chagrin, because one thing that the pushback that we're getting now from community is that in order to be resilient, that means you got to be ready and able to take a hit, right? And that thinking is, it's offensive to particularly people of color, because it means that you will never have parity, you will never have equity. You just need to be ready to get your butt kicked and stand back up, because we will never do right by you, right? That's not the intention around the resiliency programs that we have in New Orleans. It is to be smart. It is to be thoughtful. But when you don't see the intentionality, right? When you don't see the investments being made to equalize and then make the community resilient, that's why you have people kind of reacting in that way. They want to know, how does this affect me? How does it help me deal with what's coming? Not just when the next disaster happens, but my day-to-day inequities, right? The challenges that I have as I'm trying to get to work, as I'm trying to take care of my kids, as I'm trying to help my family move through life in the big easy. So when we've always got to be clear, and I think that's what a lot of people hesitate around. We talking vague platitudes about who we're trying to serve, or in awful nasty stereotypes. In order to make sure that we don't help those people, right, to marginalize them even further. And we've got to be really explicit, and we've got to be really clear about helping people who need help. Equity, thankfully, has not become a useless catchphrase. It's just not. It's still, but it's seen as an ideal, right? Which is unfortunate. And I think has everybody in here seen those really great graphics around equity? We have a personalized one in New Orleans where they use the box crates to catch beads. For those of you, everybody know what I'm talking about? The box crates to see the game. So in New Orleans, it's box crates to catch beads at a parade. So beads, okay, Mardi Gras beads, right?
Yeah, I thought you said beads too.
And if you've ever been to Mardi Gras or seen it, people usually stand on stuff because you can't see. So you have, the little kid or the smaller person standing on more than one, and the taller person standing in the back. We need to talk about addressing those genuine equities. And you're exactly right on the windows. What always strikes me about the window closing is what closes the window. And for us, what closed the window, we had a really interesting set of circumstances with Katrina. Again, while our inequities were put on display, the folks who were at the convention center who were trapped in the Superdome, but there were people of wealth and of means who had to be rescued, who were walking out of bridges, who had to be turned around by neighboring parishes because they weren't welcome coming out of New Orleans. So we saw, that happened to a lot of people. Of course, the disproportionate number were our most vulnerable citizens, but the wealthy and the white were not excluded from those experiences. And so we were ready and willing to kind of fight for each other. And what closed the door for us was a report funded by one of our local think tanks that was called The House That Uncle Sam Built. I will never forget this document. As we were investing these billions of dollars, not quick enough or not effectively enough, but we were allocating these dollars to rebuild. This document laid out the fact that New Orleans was tripling its subsidized housing, its housing volume. And so all of a sudden we had elected officials, state legislators going, well, whoa, is that maybe too much? This document failed in many, many ways, and one way that it failed was that it never once, now one page of about 20 pages, did it ever talk about the need for subsidized housing. It talked about the volume, the increase, but it never said, is that enough? And it wasn't actually. When you did the math, it was not nearly enough. It would have met the needs that we had pre-Katrina, maybe, but the needs post-Katrina where rents doubled overnight. I moved back to New Orleans in April of 06. I moved 4 blocks down and 1 story up. My rent went from $425 to $900. My income did not double. And I was fortunate because I was getting over at paying $425 a month. But we had a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing. And so this document said that made everyone who was ready to help and address this issue, it made people pause and go, oh, are we doing too much? When in fact, we weren't doing enough for the new normal post-Katrina. And we stood up, and there were other opportunities that presented themselves. We have a local data center that kind of rose up, that expanded to help combat those kinds of things. So now we have a really great data center, but the damage was done. It was all very reactionary. So again, I would urge you all to be intentional and be specific about wanting to undo the inequities that plagued these communities before Harvey rolled in here.
Right. So
Tom has his hand up, but Chriselle, you wanted to go, so y'all have to duke it out. Who goes next?
I want to jump in just to say I'm far more optimistic than I think the last 2 speakers are, and for a couple of reasons. One, I didn't leave the law firm to continue to do government work the way we've done it for the last 30 years. And I think anyone who's worked with me knows that about me. And I work for a mayor who grew up in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Houston. So I think we are well situated in Houston. And there are some fascinating similarities between Katrina and Harvey, but there are huge differences as well. And so I don't want the similarities to overwhelm the differences between these 2 cities. And one, just the difference in size between the 2 cities. The number of homes that were damaged were a large number of homes in Houston, but a relatively small percentage of our housing stock. So not to diminish the need, and it's a huge scale, but New Orleans housing stock was devastated. It was an empty city for a while, whereas Houston's was not. But the reason why I'm most optimistic is because of what I already seen. I think the warnings about the closing window is accurate, but let's take the folks who are in the shelter. FEMA's responsibility for folks who are in shelters is to return them to the place where they were before the storm. If you are living underneath a bridge before the storm, FEMA's responsibility is to get you safely back to that bridge. If you were living in a homeless shelter before the storm, FEMA's responsibility is to get you back to that homeless shelter, and so on. And we, as a city, who had been working on our homeless population for the last 5 years and had decreased our homeless population by 60% over that period of time, said this is not the way we treat people in our city. People who had come in from the storm and who had stayed in from the storm, some of them chronically homeless, some of them who had just not long-term, but homeless, we don't want them going back to where they are. And so we went to FEMA, asked them for a relatively small chunk of money, $10 million, to make sure that these people stabilize, that we weren't increasing our homeless population, and ideally we were taking a bite out of our homeless population. It's just the beginning. It's just the transitional phase. But if we can continue to do those kind of efforts and change the way FEMA does business, change the way HUD does business, it isn't easy work. It's into the details, but I think the opportunity here is for everyone in this room to roll up your sleeves and come to work with us. We'll be on opposite sides at times, but more often than not, we'll be on the same side pulling in the same direction. And there's a real opportunity to do this in Houston. So yes, there are challenges, but I think there's a bright opportunity.
I think while the opportunities is still the challenge, though, not only to rebuild, but rebuild in a way that reduces the exposure that folks have to recurring flooding as well as environmental hazards. And I turn to you, Chriselle, next. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about that? Like, do you feel like there's some really tough political decisions that are going to have to be made around where you rebuild, how you rebuild, and yeah, so how are you feeling about it?
Yeah, so we first have to address the reality of the extreme disparity that existed prior. And, I'm with you, resiliency has now become a catch-all phrase. And right now, resilient is synonymous or correlates very closely with infrastructure. And infrastructure, when we're talking, to our state government is, we want to prioritize infrastructure projects. And it's highly likely that those projects will not benefit those who are the most impacted. And when you look at a city like Houston, where there's an extreme disparity when it comes to just the existing infrastructure when it comes to storm drainage. Over 80% of the city's location of open ditch drainage, meaning that you may live in a neighborhood, instead of having covered drainage, there's an open ditch in front of your front yard.
Houston has a lot of this.
Yes, so 80% of those are in Black and brown communities. Over 80%. And of that 80%, over 40% failed to actually perform. This was pre-storm. And I'm sure that you'll see some correlations even to Shannon's map when you start looking at, even the structures, but then also overlay environmental issues as well. There's a direct correlation. And so we have to address those issues, they're those straight in space, and start looking at it from a fair share. These neighborhoods have not gotten their fair share. And so yes, Tom, while I would love to be optimistic, I think that we can't just start here going forward. We have to definitely acknowledge and address what's happened prior to.
Absolutely.
Rebecca, optimistic, pessimistic? You've been covering City Hall since 2014. What do you think?
I think it's a little bit too early. I would definitely not say I'm optimistic, but wouldn't go with pessimistic quite yet. I think that Tom's work and the city's work and FEMA's work, standing up these shelters, getting people into temporary but longer-term housing, while there are hiccups, kind of went as well as one could have hoped in this kind of size and breadth of disaster. But I think that, in addition to the relatively slow-moving government response in comparison to the tremendously acute need that families have, there are real issues of kind of the right hand not talking to the left hand from a government perspective. A couple weeks ago, I woke up and said, I should go check out this public housing complex that was hit really badly. And I figured out that the Houston Housing Authority had been charging almost all of its flooded tenants rent for units that were uninhabitable. And this was as the mayor was urging private landlords to forgive rent for uninhabitable units. And the Housing Authority has moved to correct that. They've given back rent. But that's 3 weeks after the storm, and this population that was really suffering and just kind of got missed. Even the vast majority of Houston residents who were affected don't have flood insurance. Even for those that do, I was with a family earlier this week, and they submitted $140,000 worth of flood insurance claims. All but 20,000 were kicked back, and they were told, you have to provide receipts for all of these and have somebody come out and verify that items were flood damaged. And one of the residents was like, I can take my computer to the Apple store and they'll tell me there's water damage, but they're not going to tell me there's flood damage. So I guess I can't submit this as personal property loss. So, all of those concerns, I think those are the nitty-gritty things that families are dealing with that make it difficult to be optimistic about this recovery.
And
Underneath.
I would like to answer the question exasperated instead of optimistic or pessimistic, because I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that this was possible. If I didn't think you guys could learn from our mistakes, why would I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and get on a plane to come here, and then to go home tonight, It's nice, but it's not that nice. So, I do think it's possible. At the same time, I'm exasperated that we have to have this level of conversation. I'm exasperated and frankly hurt on behalf of these communities that we're still struggling with this nonsense. And, so I am gratified to hear that you guys have all of these people here who are ready to fight for this community. But you have to be challenged. Everybody has to be challenged. No one is allowed to rest on the laurels of what you did yesterday. What have you done for me lately? As what you did like in the last 5 minutes to help this situation. Because and again, you guys have all with very great detail gone into the challenges. And so it's gonna be relentless. And so New Orleans, for those of you who have been lately, there's a lot of great success stories. There's a lot of beauty there. There's also still a lot of challenges. And there's still a lot of problems as we gird our loins for a tropical storm. I think it's a hurricane now, Hurricane Nate. After, a rain event that was kind of the precursor for Harvey, flooded New Orleans a little while ago, and we were not, and no one could deal with it. Again, and I think that becomes the thing that becomes tiresome and makes people lose hope, is that these 100-year events, these 1,000-year events that are happening every other month, it feels like, at this point, are now the new normal. And do we have to just accept it? Is there just this well, don't worry about it, we're never going to make this truly equitable? And that, more than anything, is what I would caution against. That feeling of hopelessness. Yep. Even if you're pessimistic, the pessimism is that you're not sure if you can pull it off, but you want it to happen. And I don't hear that up here. I don't hear you guys saying that Texas is like a whole nother country. So I'm expecting to see the famed Texas stick-with-itness. And you guys, I think, have a different opportunity because it is different. You have access to more wealth. Louisiana is a poorer state for a lot of reasons than Texas. You guys have access to resources. And you also have, to the point earlier, a different kind of political will, but you, again, have to be honest about this. One of the things that I think is a big part of the problem is that the underlying prejudices around those two little words, affordable housing, where people think that, again, that's why, this money, the fact that all of this comes through HUD and CDBG funding, while those programs are being proposed to be cut and reduced at the same time, and the same people who vote for people who cut and reduce those programs who are now being impacted. It's really interesting. Louisiana, Texas, and Florida. I will point out for the August 2016 flooding that struck Baton Rouge last year, the Obama administration, before President Obama left, was able to secure $2 billion for the state of Louisiana. It was still not enough. Our governor went to the Trump administration and asked for $2 billion more. They got $50 million, 50. The state of Louisiana, not New Orleans. New Orleans was outside. This was 56 of the 64 parishes, not including New Orleans, asking for $2 billion of this administration, and they got $50 million. And at the same time, because these programs were being cut, now what's happening, of course, this is a different crisis with Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and so there's going to be a different response, but we also have to be clear. You have to make sure that because I think right now it's $7 million, and then there was another allocation for another 12.
7 billion.
7 billion, I'm sorry,
14
thank you. 7
CDBG.
billion. And how much is the
And
next?
CDBG, 7 billion, and
But there's another one that I thought was,
there's another request. Do you know what the amount is, Tom? The current?
The original allocation was 7 billion FEMA, 7 billion CDBG, and the new one is coming, but I don't believe it's been specified yet.
right, but you also have to be careful, is that enough for 3 disasters of this size? And how the formulas are going to work, because when they actually pass this appropriating legislation, they named it for all of the storms in 2017. So when this first started, it was in response of Harvey, with Irma bearing down, but now there's Maria. And the allocations get doled out based on need and damage. So you could see a community like Houston that only 20% of the housing units have been, or 10%. 10%. Only 10% of your housing units have been damaged. The city itself is largely still functioning, being short-shrifted by the complete and utter obliteration of the island of Puerto Rico. Because those are going to be the formulas that they have to follow. And so then you're going to be going back for appropriation after appropriation.
And Andrew, I want to jump in because I want to leave some time for questions from the audience. And Liz handed me a bunch of questions, so I want to cut you off real quick because I want to get through these. One of the questions, and I don't know if any of you can answer this, but the question is, what are the state's fair housing law obligations in disaster recovery?
We got 2 lawyers. Fair housing obligations.
What are the state's fair housing law obligations in disaster recovery? So how will the fair housing law, what kind of protections does the fair housing law provide in this, in particular in this disaster recovery?
Yeah, so bottom line is to make sure that the fair housing law, civil rights law and fair housing law is not taken into consideration, but what happens, that it's abided by. And so when we go back to Hurricanes Ike and Dolly, we actually were part of us in Texas Appleseed actually moved forward with and was able to file an administrative complaint against the state of Texas to make sure that fair housing rights were actually abided by. And we actually got a conciliation agreement to make sure that that happened. So, we're hopeful that something like that can happen again, just to make sure that no laws are broken, because there's so many ways that we can, look at, even the way that the data is taken a look at, the way that assessments are taken into consideration. There's so many ways to potentially work around it. That's why it's important to have something like a conciliation agreement in place to make sure that outside entities such as ourselves can kind of look over with our expertise and be able to call out when fair housing law is not abided by.
And one thing to add to, I think it was Andronika that mentioned that there has been a request to waive some of the traditional regulations that govern the CDBG program and this disaster recovery allocation, such as lowering the income targeting. Fair housing and civil rights laws cannot be waived, so those do govern, the federal laws do govern the expenditure of those funds.
What Grishelle is saying is so important, because in Katrina, with the Road Home program, it was found to be racially disparate. And so our Fair Housing Action Center actually sued, but the families only got about an average about $8,000 in additional awards. So you don't want to have your Fair Housing Action Centers having to sue after something's happened. You want this upfront evaluation beforehand, because the legislation won't actually help the families long term. You'll be able to just say, oh, that program was racist. Okay.
I want to jump to the second question, and this is actually something I thought about asking too. This question is, what are cities doing to educate and prepare vulnerable populations for future major disasters? And I have some additional question to follow up on that I was going to ask around home buyers and renters when they're I've heard an issue that when you're moving into an area that's in a 100-year floodplain or not and still subject to flooding, that in many programs there's no required disclosure. There's some homeowners that you're required to have a disclosure that you're moving in a 100-year floodplain, but many people move into an area not knowing even that it is subject to flooding. And has there been discussions about changing that? And I mean, maybe it's
It is required for homeowners to have disclosures in their mortgage agreements
for federally insured mortgages.
Yes, they have to have that. So, but renters have no such requirement, and so there are many, many, many renters who have no idea that they live in the floodplain, and of course, homeowners who own their homes outright don't have to keep flood insurance either. So,
But isn't there also an issue that the floodplain maps even are
well,
just
yes,
willfully?
I think that's a huge
I mean, that's-
issue that
even if
you know, we have better floodplain maps that FEMA has not really rolled out because of the impact on insurance rates from the Bigger Waters Act of 2014. And those are outdated as well. So I think the fact, especially for a city like Houston, whose development patterns have, are changing the floodplain every single day, it's very difficult to know where the floodplain is. But I would say across the board, and this is something I brought up to Chancellor Sharp's folks earlier this week, is that across the board, people need to know what their risk is. They need to know that they're moving into an area that is flood prone, and it needs to be easy information for them to get, and it needs to be accurate and fully available so that they are able to make adequate decisions about that. I'm not to get too pessimistic again, but the real estate and development lobby is very strong in Texas. And they have done a fabulous job, frankly, of making sure that this kind of information is not readily released to buyers or renters, because it has the impact of lowering property values, and they don't want anyone to have.
Rebecca, you even covered this, right, Tom, too? But Rebecca, you covered this issue. I thought I read one of your stories that there was even pushback that there was a requirement to put signs up somewhere, and that ringing a bell at all. Tom, you want to jump in.
So I'm in the affordable housing, and so I don't know everything that happens in the rest of the city. But I do know that we've got our folks looking at our ordinances, because we know some of our ordinances are going to have to change. But the bigger issue here is even if there's information and the cheapest, the only place you can afford is in the floodway, you're going to live in the floodway. And so we have some obligations from the affordable housing side, and particularly from the federal government that has been funding these apartments over and over again. The one that was up near where Rebecca was, that was flooded with 6 feet of water last year during the tax day flood, was rehabbed. 100% of low-income people went back in there. And then HUD renewed their contract last fall at a price that was 30% above what the market rate was for that area. And so when we talk about political will, we're talking about political will at all levels of the government to step in and say, enough is enough. We're going to put affordable homes in places that don't put people's lives at risk. And I think that's the ultimate thing that we need to get to. And I think we're ready to go there. I know I am, and I believe I have many partners.
Because that relates to the next question: why do we continue to allow development in flood-prone areas? And what is the future of planning schools of thought on that subject? Which is, I think, is a question for Dr. Vanzant. But just this question of
I think there's a wide assumption that we don't permit development in floodplains, but every one of us knows that we do routinely, and city governments will admit to it. When you ask them. Why is because there's pressure from the development community to continue to allow that. And frankly, Houston, that's why I mentioned earlier that I think it's going to take a dramatic shift in how Houston builds, is that there aren't a lot of places that aren't flood prone. I mean, you saw the map that I showed. There's creeks and bayous running through that city. It's one of its many charms on a non-rainy day. But it really places a lot of people at risk, and the development patterns will have to change dramatically to be more dense and to kind of match development to infrastructure improvements in a way that we don't currently require. We've known that Houston's infrastructure system was woefully inadequate for a very long time, and everyone knows it. And so but there hasn't been the will to spend that kind of money, or the availability of the money, or the prioritization of the money to make those changes. And that's one area. I mean, I do expect that we will see big investments in hard infrastructure, for better or worse. As a planner, I think there are more cost-effective ways to do that, but I don't think the political will is there for them in terms of increasing density and building codes, which will also drive up prices. So there are trade-offs that have to be made. It does cost money to make things more resilient, and when it costs money, it passes those costs on to the property owners. And so from an affordability standpoint, that's a very difficult trade-off to make, but it's also one, I think, planners, we prioritize health, safety, and welfare, and that has to be the forefront of our minds.
Tom?
There are some very tough issues that we're going to have to work through, and I want us to get there as a community, but there are some fairly easy answers as well. Like pier and beam. 100 years ago, most of our homes in the city were pier and beam. We started doing slab on grade to save between $5,000 and $7,000 a home. That if you come back and raise them, will cost you $250,000 to $300,000 a home to raise. So it's that short-sighted approach to resilience that we've got to get away from. And so some of this is just, if it costs us $200,000 a unit for apartments that are a platform with the units above that give people a good 10 feet of clearance, let's go for that rather than the 150 garden-style apartments where when it rains, every single first floor is going to flood. And the last thing I'd say is, while we are a city without zoning and there's limitations on what we currently can and can't do, as the funder, which is the role that I sit in, we're not the housing authority that was mentioned previously, we are the city department funding entity, we get to say what we want our developers to build. And so I can make a change tomorrow. I mean, it's going to have to be supported by the political folks, but to say, here's what we will and won't fund. And then you can go to the private sector and say, here's what we're going to incentivize the private sector to do as funders. That's only a piece of it, but that's something that we can do tomorrow and not have a long drag-out situation.
Okay, Enrique, 1 minute. You want to have
Quick.
the last word?
So yeah, well, really
Okay.
quickly, one thing that we do, we can provide some hope with you guys on, and I was talking to some people who had been in New Orleans and have seen our investments in resiliency, unironically, to build smarter and to live with water. That's how we kind of phrase it. We spent some time, studying the Dutch, who actually have managed to deal with this issue in a way that makes a lot of sense. We haven't adopted everything, but we understand the principles, and we have our resilience district. We were able to receive funding from the Obama administration, where we're going to be working in one of our higher opportunity neighborhoods to help them live with water a little bit better, while simultaneously dealing with affordability. The state of Louisiana has its coastal master plan. We have a couple of communities that they also got funding through the National Disaster Resilience Competition, funded by Rockefeller and administered by, partially funded by Rockefeller and HUD. They're actually going to be relocating a community, the Ile de Jean Charles community, that floods routinely further inland. And we have a program called LA Safe that is looking at communities that are higher ground as setting them up as receiving communities, and what do we need to do to strengthen those communities as people have to be relocated. So Louisiana is starting to have these hard questions, which is something that 5 years ago you would think, knowing all of our issues, this shouldn't be something we are able to pull off, frankly. And part of it is just because of the funding sources. We were able to take advantage of the BP oil spill. This is all largely being paid for by the funds, the settlement from BP. I believe they tried to do other things with that money, but fortunately they were not allowed to. And so we were able to have these very difficult conversations and have some funding solutions. Do we even have enough money with the billions from the BP settlement? No, but we can get started. Right, we can start looking at what communities need to be relocated. We can start looking at strengthening potential receiving communities to make them communities of opportunity, so that when this low-lying area and it's time to, shut down the shop and move on. And again, I'm being kind of glib, but you all understand how difficult this is to say to someone who's been in a community, especially these smaller rural communities, for generations, and say that you can't stay here anymore. Right? It's a negotiation. There's got to be a balance. There's got to be trust, right? So this is a long-term endeavor, but we are laying out a path that Houston and other communities can follow, because you guys just have to do it on a micro level. You're going to have those hard conversations. There's going to be some communities you can invest in with parks that can flood and things like that and dig up some concrete, and then some people are going to have to be told they can't go back there.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Thank you all for coming.